Welcome back, Red Eyes members. Thank you very much for joining us. We are continuing our conversation with Sandy Frost about non-profit organizations, the Shriners, and specifically about the Royal Order of Jesters. And I do want to begin to talk a little bit about, I guess, the flow of your investigations, Sandy. You mentioned to me in the break here a little bit about, I guess, the power of intuition and how your work seemed to have been very intuitively guided in that sense. Tell us a little bit about this. It's very interesting, and it always adds another dimension to a discussion like this.
Right. I have been investigating nonprofit groups for 6 years. I first began by I actually began reporting online in 2001 by covering the field of remote viewing, which, as you know, began in the United States through an Army program during the Cold War. It had been rumored, and the CIA was dealing with information that the Soviets were using mind control and psychic means for psychic spying, so the United States started their group. And I heard about it in '96, became interested, and in fact, there's a Torbjörn Sasserson there in Sweden. He's probably your RV guy, and he might be very interesting to interview also.
We've actually had him on the show. I know Torbjörn very well, so he might even be tuning in. So if he's listening, hi Torbjörn, nice to have you along. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I love him. He is great. In fact, I have an RV book that will also be coming out, and one of it is called funny emails, and we were sending emails back and forth, and he was telling me how things were how something would be said in Swedish, and oh my gosh, it's kind of X-rated, but it's going to be part of my book.
Right, there you go.
So I began covering this field of remote viewing.
Mm.
And in a newsletter, the International Remote Viewing Association was begging for money, and I thought, well, this is weird because these guys were funded by the CIA for 20 years. Why are they begging for money? So I asked them for their documents, and I said, hey, I'd like to help. Let me see your minutes. And they said no. And I thought, what? And so that is how I began learning about all this nonprofit stuff. And so the day after my first article came out, the vice president, Paul H. Smith, released some personal information online that endangered me. And it was on, and I learned to toughen up and get tough real quick because these guys came after me. And I learned how a nonprofit group works, and essentially what I found is that I think that they didn't want me digging because he had run the conferences in the red for 3 years, and he had a book coming out and didn't want this bad information to come out about him. So after 3 years, they became compliant, and I'd sat here going, why in the hell did I learn about all this nonprofit stuff? And a month later, I was contacted by Shriner whistleblower Vernon Hill, he had been looking for a journalist for about 2 years. Nobody would touch the Shriner investigation. And I said, well, I will. Sounds interesting to me. And I checked them out, and I checked out their information because they had been, he'd been working with an former IRS agent, Paul Dolnier, and they had been doing analysis of the tax returns for some of the Shriner temples. Now, I didn't just start this. The Orlando Sentinel had investigated the Shriners 20 years previous, and over here there's a columnist named Ann Landers, and she wrote how shocked she was because the investigation found that like 2% of all the money raised by the Shriner circuses actually went to the hospitals, and this was 20 years ago. So I just picked up on the trail that they left.
That's interesting. So again, a lot of money that is being raised is being funneled to other purposes, and it isn't going to the charitable organizations. Right.
In fact, the New York Times wrote about that. And there was an internal investigation the Shriners had into corruption because one of the really bad things that happened after this internal investigation became public is two top Shriner leaders, Ralph Sem and Gene Bracewell, both of whom are jesters, were lobbying to recontract with a fundraiser, Vantage Direct Marketing, and Vantage had raised $47 million on behalf of the burned and crippled children but kept 43 of it.
Oh my God, you're kidding.
No.
Oh my God.
No, it's called, on my website, there's an article, Internal Shriner Investigation Confirms Corruption. And so, this is the mindset of these jesters who seems to have worked their way up, or they're at the top of the Shriners, and their minds are not on the best practices of business management. And it's mind-boggling, because these guys are standing in back of burned and crippled children, and they're using all these good-hearted other Shriners, these grandfathers, these elder men who are in their 60s, 70s, Mud Herring in his 90s, who are working hard, and they believe they are helping the poor, burned and crippled children, and yet they're being used by some as a front that they're just a bunch of do-gooders, when in fact they're running this little prostitution network, or,
The strange thing here then is that one thing would think that the jesters, for instance, themselves would be happy that this is coming to the surface, so that this can be exposed and they can root out the problem, because again, this isn't what it was set up to be at the beginning, or so it's very strange, isn't it?
Well, I think that the Shriners are going to be happy because the jesters are the problem. I don't think that there's really much good that the jesters do. I think that they're just a party club, right?
See what you mean.
Right. And so for those good Shriners who work so very hard, and in fact they're having their annual conference over July 4th in San Antonio, Texas. At the same time, of course, the jesters are going to meet there. And the unfortunate thing about this entire situation is that there is a tipping point between public benefit of helping the little kids, of giving these older retirees something really good and happy to do, and the prosecutions and investigations by the FBI, the ICE people, which is Immigration and Customs. At what point do they cancel each other out?
Yeah.
And I think that from what we said the hour before, I believe that what needs to happen is the IRS needs to launch a forensic investigation into the Royal Order of Jesters, if they've not done that already, and I do not know for sure, and actually go through the books, see where the money goes, get the credit card receipts, and track all the accounting. And then once that is done, I believe that they'd have enough evidence to suspend their nonprofit status, and I really think that needs to happen.
And again, this is in one sense fresh off the presses. There will be announcements made by this probably throughout the coming week here, and then we'll see what happens, right?
Yes, and that would be in regard to the indictments out of Brazil of Richard Scher, who is the owner of a fishing tour company who took jesters fishing in Brazil, and they were called as witnesses in a federal defamation lawsuit to testify about their firsthand of drug use and sex with minors while on fishing trips in Brazil. And some of those little girls, actually, did go to the Brazilian federal police, talked about how they were lured off their Indian reservations, told that they would be hired to cook and clean, and when they got to the fishing boats, found these North American tourists and were told to drink whiskey and have sex with these guys, some girls as young as 13.
It's so horrible. And I want to also backtrack a little bit, Sandy, and ask you a little bit more about the field of remote viewing, because I guess you were at the time associated with the remote viewing groups. You were interested in this as a genuine field of study, right? Is that correct? Yes.
Me being ex-military and me being an intuitive, I thought, wow, this is a neat combination of things that I can really relate to. And I went to my first remote viewing conference in 2001 and stood in the hall and stood there and went, nobody's writing about this stuff. And so I started to write about this stuff for a website called sweet101.com. And after I began investigating IRVA for the nonprofit claims, my work was censored offline, and then I became the target of a hate site that mocked my Native American heritage, and by making fun of one of my animal spirits, which is wolf. So, we could talk about my animal spirits and that actual side of it, because you know, just because anybody is different doesn't mean that they're wrong.
That's right.
And so I come at this from a very different cultural standpoint, and I can credit my animal spirits. Wolf is my primary, but then we have badger. I have 2 badger pelts, and so little badgers dig.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we were in Southern Oregon, I discovered
So we just got cut off there from Skype, but Sandy, you were just telling me when you first got involved with the remote viewing, this group, and how people there basically started to make fun of your culture background and some of the spirit animals that you relate to. Isn't that right?
Yes. The my primary spirit is wolf, and I'm very open, and I will discuss this and write about these things because it's part of who I am. And so the other animals are badger, as I said, and beaver. So I dig 24/7, and then a holy man bestowed on me white eagle feather medicine and bestowed upon me a protective spirit of Wolverine. So that's quite a picture.
Interesting.
And
do you feel that this, in that sense, has helped you in your investigations in regards to what these animals also represent? Like the digger, for instance, if we talk about the badger or the beaver, right?
Sure, and it goes back to balance, because when I first started this, the Shriner investigation, I would work 16, 18 hours a day. The research is, as you know, with your own work.
Yes.
Before you even contacted me for this interview, I'm sure you did days of research reading my stuff. Who is this person? Do we really want to talk to her? And so the research is unimaginable. I live my life in a strange way. I pay attention to synchronicity, and if things are effortless, then I know that I'm doing the right thing. And in many aspects, this investigation into especially the Royal Order of Jesters has at times been effortless in terms of access to documentation. We can sit and it can be very interesting, and we can talk about how the Brazilian fishing guide talked about how they used anal beads, and I mean, and how they smoke pot and all this other kind of stuff. But the bottom line is it comes down to the documents. And so when I stumbling upon, for example, that FBI application for arrest warrants in the case of Len Wah Chong, I stumbled on that by accident. And I read it, and that is where I found the wiretap conversations of the judge and the retired police captain. In fact, when it comes to the human trafficking aspect, at one point, according to this FBI application, the judge was telling Len Wah Chong that they were discussing how the girls were going to New York City and getting arrested, and then they were not illegal aliens anymore. These women who were being trafficked were from China mostly, and they came to the United States with the hope of living a different life. Yeah. This is not an indictment on China or Asia in any way, but people, the good and the bad of America is anyone can live their dream. The bad is sometimes the dreams turn into nightmares.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the nightmares that you and I are discussing right now is the human trafficking aspect of this investigation into the Royal Order of Jesters. And so imagine, your sister or mom or dad wanting to go to another country, and when they get there, they get into this little pipeline and they go from place to place, kind of like how the slaves went from the South to the North in the American Civil War, and they end up in a place where they can work. Well, 9 of these illegal Asian illegal immigrant women ended up in the employment of Len Wah Chong, this woman who ran the 4